In the late 60s, we started the Great Society, where we were going to solve poverty in America through welfare funding. Once you got into that and we found out that we couldn't solve it, we were into a program that we couldn't cure. And so America began to live on borrowed money, to a large degree funding our social programs, what we would now call entitlement programs.
20 years later, in 1981, federal spending had increased to something in the $500 billion range. By the time Ronald Reagan left office, federal spending was up above $1 trillion a year. And indeed, a federal debt which was $914 billion in 1981 had grown to $2.8 trillion in 1989.
In 1980, the percentage of the personal income tax needed to pay the interest on the debt was about 30%. But by 1992, 12 years later, that almost doubled to 60%. That's a little frightening, because if we continue on that current course, some say by the end of this decade, it'll take all of the income from the personal income tax to pay the interest on the national debt. And then we're broke. Where will the money come from to pay the bills?
By the end of the Bush presidency, the debt was $4.2 trillion, the acknowledged debt, not taking into account pension debts, student loan debts, unfunded liabilities for Social Security.
America owes $4 trillion. It must borrow $1.1 billion every day in order to keep up the pretense of the prosperity that we talk about today. And so for a number of years, it has been using up not simply its capital, that is all gone, but it has been using up its borrowing power. And when we come to the end of our borrowing power, when no one will put any of their value, like the Japanese, the Germans, the British, and others, into the American economy, then there must come to pass the coming break point. And the coming break point is upon us.
It took 20 years for the government to officially examine the problem. In 1984, President Ronald Reagan appointed a special group of private businessmen to do an independent study on the trends in government spending. It was called the Foundation for the President's Private Sector Survey on Cost Control. It was headed by businessman J. Peter Grace and became more widely known as the Grace Commission.
Mr. Grace put together a huge group of private businessmen, all privately funded, no government money involved, and they began to look at the government and how it operated and what they paid for things.
They raised, as I recall, something like $74 million of private money, no government money was spent. They enlisted some 160 top executives to spend a year of their life on this thing, and they hired, with a budget they developed for themselves, they had about 2,000 employees. And they did an analysis of the U.S. government and decided it was out of control, but they came up with, I believe, over 2,000 recommendations to somehow contain this monster.
When I asked Peter Grace to take on the responsibility of running this commission, I had no idea the kind of energetic but healthy troublemaking I was contracting for. With dedication and selflessness, you succeeded where others failed. You provided clear, concise, and practical recommendations to enormously complicated problems. The public now knows some hope and optimism that government can at last be made lean, cost-effective, and responsive to the people. That's why they're behind the Grace Commission's work, and that's why they're behind our plan for deficit reduction.
The bottom line was they found something just under $500 billion worth of waste that could be trimmed out of the government on an annual basis without changing a single program. In other words, you didn't have to cancel welfare, you didn't have to cancel Medicare and Social Security. All you had to do is go in with standard business practices and trim out the waste, the overspending, the double billing, the bills that never got paid on time, those kinds of things.
And unlike the people sitting in the middle of the federal government mess who see no problems, they were able to see a lot of problems and project in the future what would happen if things weren't changed.
They came to the conclusion that if we didn't make some substantial change in the direction of this economy and some substantial reduction in the amount of deficits that we're running, that the government would reach a point where they could no longer fund themselves either through taxes or borrowing.
At that time, many people took it as alarmist and so forth, didn't take it seriously. But the shocking thing is now to go back and look at that report and see it track the projections they made for 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, are tracking within a few percent. And what it's predicting is a major, major collapse of this country.
It was this startling information that prompted the co-chairman of the Grace Commission, Harry Figge Jr., to co-author a book to alert the nation's leaders, as well as the citizens at large, to make needed changes. It became a New York Times bestseller. One powerful graph in the book tracks the amount of borrowed money the government overspends each year. Although the levels fluctuate slightly from year to year within the various administrations, on the whole, the spending is increasing and will go off the chart within the next few years. Despite the inevitable consequences of this fiscal crisis, Congress continues to accelerate its irresponsible overspending, which further contributes to the national debt. The Gramm-Rudman Act of 1985 made it mandatory for the government to live within its income and to balance the budget by 1991. The Grace Commission tracked the discrepancies between the estimated budgets and the actual spending. Despite the legal mandate, the amounts estimated and spent soared to new heights by 1991. According to the Grace Commission, Congress and the President have been using creative ways to get around the law. One loophole Congress uses is to regularly apply for temporary budget extensions. These extensions were originally designed only to be used in emergency cases. However, their use has now become common practice. Another deceptive practice Congress employs is to siphon the funds out of the Social Security Trust Fund. This allows them to reduce the annual deficit numbers presented to the public.
We've been overpaying into the Social Security Fund now for the better part of about 6 or 7 years, and yet it doesn't have a dime in it. It's got a lot of numbers in it. But in truth, the government takes the money out, spends it in the general budget so they don't have to show that as a deficit, and then substitutes an IOU in the form of zero coupon bond from the government. And since that's called an internal transfer of government assets, in other words, the government says they own the trust fund. Therefore, when they transfer the money out of the trust fund into the general economy, they don't have to show that as a deficit. So it's lies.
Another technique Congress uses to mask excess spending is to transfer budget overruns or excess spending into the next fiscal year. This creates the illusion of reduced spending without incurring the pain of actually making cuts. Another effective way the administration and Congress gets around the law is to shift many projects off budget.
Examples of that is the post office. Post office government operation doesn't show up in the budget. They found arguments to take it off budget. The Persian Gulf War. No reason for that not to be in the budget. It's not. They find reasons to take it off balance sheet. Many of the entitlements programs, those are the most scary, are also off balance sheet. And if you did this in business, you'd go to jail for fraud.
The Grace Commission also found that when U.S. debt is compared to the growth of debt in other countries, it's higher and growing faster than all other industrialized nations in the world. Perhaps the most alarming information is presented in this graph, which depicts the dramatic rise in actual U.S. debt. The predictions since 1985 have incredibly been right on target. And if its tracking record remains accurate, in a few short years, the country will be bankrupt. Americans may get the false impression that the budget is being dealt with because it's talked about in nearly every newscast and election campaign. The truth is that very few have been bold enough to confront or even address the truth about the impending financial crash. In light of the accuracy of the Grace Commission's predictions, why didn't Congress fully support their recommendations?
Because it was a Republican issue versus Democrats, and the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate by that time, most of the Grace Commission's recommendations never got implemented.
Some of the recommendations that would save a lot of money require a vote of Congress. And every bit of waste in the federal government has a champion somewhere in Congress who sees that not as waste but as a gravy train.